Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Detroit Institute of Art's Thursdays at the Museum program. I'm Amanda Harrison, a Community Engagement Manager at the DIA. Thank you so much for joining us. And just as a reminder, general admission to the museum is always free for residents in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb County. So if you like what you see in today's program, I want to encourage you to come down to the museum and see the real pieces in person. Throughout the program, I'm going to be taking your questions. So to ask one, log into YouTube using your Gmail account or by leaving a public comment on this Facebook page. And Kathleen McBroom is behind the scenes running our slide deck. This June, we're celebrating Pride Month with a two-part series called Art Pride, the works of LGBTQ plus artists in the DIA's collection. Today is part 2 with Paul Butcher and Dave Galley. Hey guys, thanks for being here.
Hey.
Good to be seen.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So like you had mentioned, we're going to be continuing our celebration of Pride Month and looking at part 2 of the Art Pride, Thursdays at the Museum, a virtual tour of selected works by artists in the LGBTQ plus community in the DIA's collection. And these artists have been recognized as some of the leaders of modern and contemporary art. All of these artists are self-identified or have been so identified by their partners, family, or official biographers. Well, last week, if you tuned in, we saw the ways in which these innovative artists created paintings and sculpture and photography of themselves and the world around them, and where they contributed to the timeline of art and history. This week, Paul and I will continue to discuss these amazing works and the journey of these artists. We hope the tour will fairly represent the beauty and power of the art and the tremendous strength and creativity of these artists and the human spirit. So get ready. All right, Paul, you want to take it away?
If you joined us last week, you got a preview of this slide. We went a little long, so this is our first slide this week. This is a unique oil on canvas painting by the artist Ellsworth Kelly. What stands out when you look at this? Now, for me, I see really only two colors, very bold, a red and a blue in very reduced, simple shapes. Just so you know, 2-color and 3-color paintings is really what Ellsworth Kelly is known for. Ellsworth Kelly's artwork is an example of art that does not fit neatly into any typical art historical genre. Although Kelly is now considered an essential innovator and contributor to the American art movement, it was very hard for many to find the connection between Kelly's work and the dominant stylistic trends at the time. Truly, to kind of understand Ellsworth Kelly's style and context, we need to look at the influences from his past. He was born in 1923 in a small town about 70 miles north of New York City, but his family moved to Ordell, New Jersey, and living near and visiting the Ordell Reservoir. His paternal grandmother introduced him to the study of birds when he was about 8 or 9 years old. There he developed this passion for form and color. It's thought that his paintings can be traced back to his early bird watching and his study of this 2-color and 3-color birds he saw. I just love this slide because it really helps me understand his work, right? Kelly also credits John James Audubon with having a strong influence on his work throughout his career. Kelly studied art at the Pratt Institute in 1941 until he was drafted into World War II on January 1st, 1943. During World War II, he served with other artists and designers in a deception unit known as the Ghost Army. These ghost soldiers used inflatable tanks, trucks, and other elements to mislead the Axis forces. He says that his exposure to military camouflage during that time became just a really basic, essential part of his art training. Kelly spent time in Europe after the war, but returned to the US in 1954, and he describes the art world as, quote, tough. After an exhibition in 1956, Kelly's art was considered more European than popular in New York at that time. However, afterwards, his work of this time period provided a useful bridge from the vanguard American geometric abstractionism of the late 30s and 40s to the minimalism and reductive art of the mid-60s and 70s. Kelly always wanted his art to be voluptuous to a certain point. He says any connection to shapes of body were coincidental and just unplanned. Kelly left New York City for Spencertown, New York, in upstate New York in 1970. He was joined there by his partner, photographer Jack Shear, in 1984. In an interview in W Magazine in 2012, I love this, Kelly describes their life together, as a civilized country life. He would work a full day in his studio, then return home at 7 p.m. Dinner was served at 8. Then they'd move into the living room and either read a book or watch Downton Abbey. I just love that. But he said he was a very private man about his personal life. He turned down numerous opportunities to do photo shoots for Out magazine. After his death in 2015, his partner of 31 years, Jack Shear, now serves as the director of the Ellsworth Kelly Foundation. What's interesting at the DIA, on occasion, the title of artwork can change when scholarship or new evidence is presented about a piece of artwork. We did that a few years ago when we changed Monet's piece from gladioli to rounded flower bed. But in this particular case, simply because the artist noticed it was incorrect, we had to change the title. It really happened. Ellsworth Kelly came to Detroit in September of 1970, and he saw his artwork in our collection, and he told us that we had the wrong title. We had been calling it Red Blue. He explained that the proper title is Blue Red. He said the work is titled by designating the object first, and here it's that blue lozenge, and then the background, red. Oops, we made a mistake. Little egg on our face in front of the artist. I love that story.
That's such a great, Paul, that's such a great story too. Just it shows humanness, right? We're all human.
Exactly.
Sometimes we make mistakes.
I think I would have done red blue because to me the red is the biggest piece, right? Shows what I know about art. Yeah.
Right. And reading it, I guess left to right, you run into the red first and then the blue.
Yeah.
And Paul too, the DIA owns 10 of his pieces in various mediums. And I've seen this out several years ago, and it seems to get rotated too with like a black and white piece.
He also was an architect. He designed his own art museum in Austin, Texas, that now houses the Ellsworth Kelly Foundation. So he was really a jack of all trades. Yeah.
And one last question on that, Paul. Was that a video that you watched on that one?
No.
No. Oh, awesome. All right. Thanks, Paul. So were there any questions, Amanda?
No questions yet, but I'm wondering if our curators know that we're sharing that story.
They do. They should know. I just didn't add that. It was part of our approved speech. So
of course, I'm teasing. That was a great story. Thanks for sharing.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. So as we move through the 20th century, right, we've got our next piece is by the artist Robert Rauschenberg. And the medium on this is screen print in oil on canvas. And so I'm asking, what do you see? This is one of those pieces where you really need to get in front of it and up close and take a look. But of course, not too close. As we allow ourselves to examine this piece, we notice that this color palette is really filled with the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. And then we see some black, swirling black lines. Excuse me. But we also see some images, right? We see images of a woman there, and then an astronaut, perhaps maybe a tugboat, and even the Statue of Liberty is in there. In one sense, we see a mix of topical themes like spaceflight and the urban landscape, right? We talked about the changing landscape last time. And we see a reference to Peter Paul Rubens' Venus Before the Mirror. And you want to go to the next one? So we'll show that. So there you've got Rubens painting on the left, and we kind of showing you where he had taken that and put that onto his canvas. By 1962, Rauschenberg is beginning to incorporate not only found objects, but found images, if you will, into his paintings. He integrated printing techniques using photographs gleaned from newspapers and magazines and such, and transferred them to the canvas by a silkscreen method, in really continuing the spirit of his assemblage he had pioneered earlier. All of the images seem to relate to water, flux, or change, and are juxtaposed against an imagery of timeless beauty. And that would be our Rubens with Venus looking into the mirror. And here's some good news about this contemporary art, right? The canvas is open to interpretation, meaning what? What we mean by that is the artist states that there is no single one interpretation that's going to be over any other interpretation. So, you know, what you see in it is your experience, and that's what the interpretation is. So that's good news. Normally found in the contemporary galleries, this piece is temporarily down the hall into another gallery in the second floor on the Kresge reception area, right around the corner from the main hallway. Now, Milton Ernest, or Robert Rauschenberg, was born in 1925 in Texas. He later attended Black Mountain College in North Carolina. There, he had met Joseph Albers, who was very influential to him. In 1950, Rauschenberg wed a longtime friend, and they had one son, and then divorced soon after in 1953. And then soon after that, he entered a relationship with the younger painter Jasper Johns, among others. They had met at a party in the winter of 1953 and became friends. And several months later, they became romantic as well as artistic partners. In 1955, Rauschenberg moved into the same building as Johns, and they worked together every day, encouraging each other and playing off of each other's ideas. However, while their styles were initially too different to really form a truly coherent movement, their artistic partnership got intense. Johns, whom we'll talk about next, was eventually featured on the cover of Art News in 1957, and the Museum of Modern Art bought a few of his pieces. This unfortunately caused a problem between Johns and Rauschenberg, as Johns is relatively new to the scene and Rauschenberg's been around for a while. Over time, Rauschenberg came to believe strongly, too, in the power of art as a catalyst for social change. And we'll take a look at what he's done. In 1984, he announced Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange, ROCI, at the United Nations. This would culminate in a 7-year, 10-country tour to really encourage world peace and understanding. He created the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation in 1990 to promote awareness of the causes he cared about, such as world peace, the environment, and humanitarian issues. And lastly, he was awarded the National Medal of Arts by President Bill Clinton in 1993. In 2000, Rauschenberg was honored with AMFAR's Award of Excellence for artistic contributions to the fight against AIDS. He died in 2008 and is survived by his partner of 25 years and his son. And here's an interesting fact, too, about our collection. We're starting to see, and with contemporary art, museums are collecting even more than just, say, 1 or 2 pieces. The DIA owns 39 pieces of his artwork in various mediums.
Dave, I don't want to interrupt, but there's also an interesting fact. I own 6 pieces of Rauschenberg. They're coffee mugs that I bought at West Elm, but I love them every day. I have a little coffee, and then there's a saying on the lip inside each mug from Rauschenberg. So I have coffee with Robert Rauschenberg every day for only $1.99.
Well, that's the way to go.
Yeah.
That's the way to go. Coffee and art on a budget. So that's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Try to regain composure, Dave. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I can.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on to the next artwork. And here we have a work on paper by Rauschenberg's one-time partner, Jasper Johns, and he created this between 1967 and 1968. It is a lithograph printed in color ink on handmade paper. And it's about 33.5 inches by 25.5 inches. And we wanted to throw in here a little something about lithography. Like, what is that, right? What is this printing technique? Well, Lithography is a printing technique that uses a flat, heavy limestone, polished smooth, to be drawn upon it using either litho crayons or specialized greasy pencils. Once the artist is satisfied with the image, the surface is then chemically treated. Okay, this helps bond the greasy pencil marks to the stone, and it'll also hold the ink. Once the stone is inked, and then water is wiped in the blank areas, paper is laid over and extreme pressure is applied, creating the image on that paper once you peel that paper off. Just a reminder, this piece is not out on view because works on paper are only on view for a short period of time and then are rotated due to their sensitivity between light and moisture. Okay, so what do we see here? Right, we see a flag. We recognize that this is a flag, and it looks like the American flag, but not in the traditional red, white, and blue colors. The Boulder flag at the top is orange and black and green, and the lower flag sort of looks like it's a washed out in gray and white, perhaps maybe even a negative image of the upper flag. So Johns was known for his images of the American flag. Right? The symbol of flag to this day carries a host of connotations and meanings that shift from person to person. And it was an ideal subject for Johns' foray into visually exploring, quote, what he called, or the things the mind already knows, like the American flag. Some viewers may see national pride, while others may only see imperialism and oppression. So is it a flag? Or is it a painting of a flag? Well, some more good news with these guys, these artists. Just like Rauschenberg's piece earlier, the interpretation of this artwork is entirely up to the viewer. Okay, so then we'll move on. Born in Augusta, Georgia, Johns spent his life in South Carolina, living with different family members after his parents divorced. So recounting this period, he once said, "In the place where I was a child, there were no artists and there was no art. So I really didn't know what that meant." After a few semesters at the University of South Carolina, Johns headed to New York City and studied at Parsons School of Design in 1949. He also was drafted into the military during the Korean War and was stationed in Sendai, Japan in 1952 and 53. At the end of 53, in the first part of 54, he moved back to New York City, where he eventually met Robert Rauschenberg. As mentioned earlier, they became a couple after months of being friends. They additionally shared friendships with another gay couple, choreographer Merce Cunningham and composer John Gage. And here we have a great photo of the two men enjoying a hearty laugh in 1980. Working together, they explored the contemporary art scene and began developing their own ideas. And as I mentioned earlier with Rauschenberg, they realized, though, that they had two completely different styles and they really didn't mesh. In 1958, gallery owner Leo Castelli discovered Johns while at a visit to Rauschenberg's studio. So it's almost like he popped into Johns' studio by mistake, right? And then he saw the work, loved it, and gave him his first one-man show. At that exhibition, Alfred Barr, the founding director of MoMA, purchased a few of his artworks, and then John's career as an artist took off. The art world, though, at this time was still overwhelmingly heterosexual. And while Johns and Rauschenberg were invited out as a couple, they nor their hosts were ever really explicit as to the relationship between them. It was something that was there but not talked about. This, as well as the explosion of his fame and perhaps maybe Rauschenberg's jealousy, caused a lot of tension between the two men, actually ending their relationship. In 1990, Jasper Johns was awarded the National Medal in Arts, and in 2011, President Barack Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Today, Johns works with mediums such as paintings, prints, and sculptures in his home studio in Connecticut. And we're fortunate enough to own 13 of his pieces in various mediums. Paul, any videos you've seen on this?
I've not seen a video, but I've only seen the piece that you showed us once, and that was shown during the pop art exhibition a few years ago.
Yep.
And it was just so cool to see the John's piece there. You know, before he did flags, he was doing numbers. So this whole idea of him having us look at things that we already know was really kind of cool at that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that, you know, we all recognize the numbers, and we recognize flags. Yeah. So really taking a new spin, a new take on what we already used to and know. And I think we're going to see that in the next two artists too.
Well,
Dave, if I can just pop in, we have a really interesting question from our audience member too. Jan is asking, why do you think that if either of you have opinions on why John's became a household name, but Rauschenberg, I don't even think I said his name right, I'm sorry, didn't. And she's wondering if there's maybe a difference in personalities that helped one become more successful over the other, or if you had thoughts on that.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that I personally would need to do a little more homework and digging into maybe what their relationship was. I've heard of something called the Warhol Diaries, and I think they may discuss a lot of different artists that Warhol was aware of and knew about and such, and we may be able to discover from there. And since John's is living, I'm sure that there's some biographies out there that might explain it a little bit better than we have here.
Yeah. You know, it's so funny, Dave. You know, normally when we're doing these, we don't talk a lot about the background of the artist. We talk more about the art. But because we're doing this as an LGBTQA plus kind of thing, we've added a little bit more about their personal lives. But you know, we know much more about the art than their personal lives normally. So I don't know the answer to that question.
And it's such an interesting question too, because it's applicable to everyone. Like, why are some artists more noteworthy over others? So I appreciate the question, Jan, and thanks for taking a stab at it.
I wonder, Jan, if it's not because John's stuff was so a little easier to look at, perhaps. You know, it was these numbers, and again, much like the one we saw on the flag, dominant, faded, reverse images. The flags were that same way, so it's something that we knew. And Rauschenberg's, were very, very busy, and you may had to have, with John's, you didn't have to think, right? With Rauschenberg's, you're trying to figure out what all did he do, and then what's he trying to say. And both of them were part of I think the word maybe neo-dada. They didn't really care what you thought. It could be whatever you wanted, right?
Wow. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great, thanks. All right, Paul, you ready to do favorite?
These next two artists are ones that have been presented before on Thursdays at the museum, but we've added them to this LGBTQ plus talk for a couple of reasons. One, both these artists are very out and very proud. And it's very cool to see how they've taken what came before them and expanded and reimagined those ideas and concepts. And three, there are people who perhaps haven't been to the normal Thursdays at the museums, and we wanted to include these two people. The piece that you're looking at normally hangs in the contemporary galleries. This piece is temporarily on view in the Kresge reception area on the second floor at the far south end of the museum, closer to downtown. But it's just a few feet away from the Rauschenberg that Dave just showed us. Kehinde Wiley was just 30 years old when he painted this 10-foot by 10-foot portrait of a young Black man in a very heroic composition. He's sitting high in the saddle on his rearing horse. The man's looking right at us. He's wielding a big saber, a big sword. Wiley paints this image using bright, bold colors, precise lines, exact likeness. And when you look at the background, you see large filigree that's filling the nondescript kind of pink and red sky. The pose that you're looking at, though, is reminiscent of a painting from the 1700s. But look at what the man is wearing. And Kathleen, maybe you can help us. Look at his low-riding jeans. Look at his white T-shirt. Look at his Timberland boots. Look at on his arm, there's just this glorious tattoo that goes all the way down his arm that's holding the saber. But look, the horse is the same. The blanket's the same. The saddle is the same, right? So what Wiley is having us do is really kind of mirroring this image that's in the Louvre Museum, the one on the right. It's by Theodore Géricault. It's a painting done in 1812 called The Officer of the Hussars Commanding a Charge. What Wiley would do is he would take photographs of famous paintings throughout big museums in the world. He'd put them in a book. He'd go out on the street in Harlem, go up to young black men and say, pick one of these pictures and strike a pose. He'd take a photo of it. He'd go back to his studio and paint. And then what he would do by painting this model in a position of authority, he celebrates the strength of all black men, declares that they possess a power that's uniquely their own. In other words, Wiley is reimagining old masters with black protagonists. What I love right now is where this is hanging. You walk down the south spine, and right before you turn into the Kresge area, there's a big painting of a big white horse and a French general on it. You turn the corner and you run into this young, powerful black man. Just a great juxtaposition, right? Wiley was born in 1977 in Los Angeles. He was, as a young child, his mother would take both him and his twin brother to museums. Wiley would say that during that time, he never saw black faces on the wall in a museum, but he loved art. He got his bachelor's in fine arts in San Francisco and his master's in fine arts at Yale in 2001. He then became an artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And that's where you see the work that we see today at the DIA. He describes himself as gay, but he also explains that his sexuality is more complicated than that. To quote him, and I'm going to read this, "My sexuality is not black and white. I'm a gay man who has occasionally drifted. I'm not bi. I've had perfectly pleasant romances with women, but they weren't sustainable. My passion wasn't there. I was always looking at the guys." I kind of like that. Kehinde Wiley is known for painting many celebrities like Michael Jackson, Mary J. Blige, but in 2018, he painted a portrait that will forever be in American history. And I will quote him again here. Let me read this. "I am the first African-American painter to paint the first African-American president of the United States." Barack Obama's portrait hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., part of the Smithsonian. And I just love it. It's about the same size as our Officer of the Hussars. It's huge, but it's very Kehinde Wiley, right? Kehinde Wiley had an exhibition a few years ago, a retrospective, probably about 80 pieces of his work at the museum in Toledo. And what was so cool there is that he spent 2 weeks in Toledo working with inner city kids and art projects, and just a tremendously talented and proud person. Any questions? We only own one of his pieces. I'm so glad we do.
No questions from our audience, but this is a great piece. Thanks for sharing.
So Dave's got an equally exciting piece to talk about now.
Right, and I was going to say too about about that Wiley. It's a real showstopper. Every time you're doing tours or walking past it, people always ask, what about this one? Oh my God, look at this one. It's a terrific piece, and we're like you said, we're fortunate to have that piece in the museum's collection. And we have another showstopper right here too. I mean, this one's almost as large as that 10-foot by 10-foot piece. And I apologize, I don't have the exact dimensions here, but this is a newer piece that entered the DIA's collection, and it's very large, and we're noticing a lot of vibrant colors and all of these rich textures all over it. And this is done by the artist Micheline Thomas. And so let's take a moment and look at it. This is something that you may want to, if you bring your family there, sit down in front of it, pause and take a look at it. I want to steal what we said during practice. So, if you got children or grandchildren coming, have them sit down in front of it and take a look at it and really, drink it in. What are we noticing here, right? We see a multitude of patterns and colors, and that leads our eye all over the place. We see, this brown-skinned woman in a blue dress with a pink hat with netting, and we see like these tiger stripes on the bottom of her shoes. And we see a lot of pillows, several pillows are joining her on that couch or love seat. We even notice the ottoman where her feet are resting in that bold red and burgundy and orange and white colors. And once you stop to look at it in person, you'll start noticing that you're seeing something like three-dimensional, if you will. You're noticing these numerous rhinestones and beads that, with the help of her assistants, Mickalene Thomas added that and affixed it to her work. And here, what she's doing is she's exploring notions of beauty from a contemporary perspective, is influenced by popular culture and perhaps pop art. Her works have been interpreted as, quote, investigating the artist-model relationship, but from an updated perspective as female intersubjectivity, right, and same-sex desire. We've got a female sitter model, and then we have the female artist. These women, the women in these works seem the very picture of self-confidence. Yet something also about them suggests maybe an amateurish vulnerability. And then for Thomas, rather than talking about the individual paintings, she prefers to talk about the volatile emotions that possess her while making them. Thomas was born in 1971 in Camden, New Jersey. She and her older brother, Paul, were raised solely by their mother after their parents' divorce. As a teenager, Mickalene and her mother had a very intimate and yet strenuous relationship due to her mother's addiction to drugs and Thomas dealing with her sexuality. She spent years estranged from her mother, trying to figure out a way to tell her that she is a lesbian. This was documented, by the way, in the short film, Happy Birthday to a Beautiful Woman, A Portrait of My Mother. This film debuted on HBO in 2014 and runs periodically. In the film, her mother, Sandra Bush, is described as her longtime muse. In the film, Ms. Bush talks about careers, relationships, beauty, and her fatal illness. Says Thomas herself, using my mother as a model has allowed us time to establish this nice relationship for me to get to know her. I feel like it's a way to making her happy. Thomas lived and attended school in Portland, Oregon, and studied pre-law and theater arts. In 1994, she attended an exhibition by the artist Carrie Mae Weems, which she described as a very profound and transforming moment in her life. She visited that exhibition 10 times and developed an obsessive interest in art. And then in 2002, she graduated from Yale and was chosen artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Throughout this time, she found herself immersed in the growing culture of DIY artists and musicians, leading her to begin her own body of work. She's fearless in her exploration of sexuality and gender. While her work remains, say, in the feminist tradition of subverting the male gaze and letting females subjects seize the power, they're practicing their allure on a female artist. Sort of gives this dynamic an additional twist. Today, she works out of her studio in Brooklyn. Before we move on, I want to leave you with some quotes from Thomas, right? I am also playing with artifice, what's real and not real, and how we perceive things, right? And we sort of got that from a few prior artists. When asked, why not paint men? Well, she replies, how do you know that I haven't? So that could lead us to believe, is that image a man or a woman on that couch? Yeah. Any questions there, Amanda?
And again, Dave, this one is just, it will just blow you away. You sit at it and you say somebody went crazy with a glue gun. It looks like that ottoman that you talked about looks like it has Tic Tacs glued to it. The wood paneling in the back has Sikorsky crystals. It's just, kids eat it up with a spoon. It's just a fantastic thing.
I eat it up with a spoon.
and Dave, I think it's something like 12 by 16. It takes up an entire wall, and there's usually a bench. And if I were the grandparent, I would have the kids sit on the bench and strike a pose and take the bottom of their shoes, just like her mother's there. It's just perfect.
Yeah, the bottom of those shoes, right?
I want those shoes, please, in my own collection. Like, oh, I absolutely love this piece. I love that it has the three-dimensional qualities, and a lot of our audience loves it as well. We got a number of very positive comments about the piece and congratulating you on your work.
Traditionally, it's in the same gallery where there's some a collage of Spinny Andrews, and it actually has pieces of his clothes in his self-portrait. And so all of a sudden, between this one and that one, kids go, "Wait a minute, I could do that," and they see art that just speaks to them. It's just amazing. Yeah.
Right. So we're seeing like some examples of like assemblage. Right. We could call that assemblage too, and we see other three-dimensional pieces in there as well. And
beautiful.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks, Paul.
All right. Well, our final photography piece today is a portrait of Sam Wagstaff. It was taken by the American photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. And again, as Dave said, this is not on view right now because it has to rotate because photographs are a little sensitive to light and to humidity. But look at this. What do you notice? What do you see here? For me, I see a man maybe close to my age. I wish. But you see, some wrinkles. You see gray hair in his eyebrows. You see him looking straight ahead at us, pretty sternly, pretty seriously. You see him a little off center. You see the background black, right? Again, the sitter is Sam Wagstaff, who is an American art curator and collector, as well as a mentor, patron, and lover of Robert Mapplethorpe. This piece, though, also has a very direct connection to the DIA. Sam Wagstaff was our first curator of contemporary art here at the DIA from 1968 to 1971. And he brought with him a new vitality to the contemporary art. He also encouraged exploration by artists in the forefront of contemporary art. But what I really like is he was particularly interested in the Detroit's Cass Corridor artist, an audience that was previously just kind of ignored. Shortly after leaving Detroit and returning to New York City in 1972, Mapplethorpe and Wagstaff were introduced. Wagstaff came from a very, very wealthy family in New York City, but he was physically attracted to Mapplethorpe right at the onset, but also the psychological connection was there as well. Wagstaff was looking for someone to spoil, and Mapplethorpe wanted nothing more than to be spoiled. So Wagstaff found the right man, and it was love at first sight. Mapplethorpe was born in a Catholic working class family in Floral Park, Queens, there in New York. He described his household as rigid. In addition, his Catholic training predisposed him of feeling very guilty and sinful, and he had a very turbulent relationship with his father. His fascination with art started in the 6th grade. He briefly attended but never finished his studies at Pratt. He became friends with the young Patti Smith. We know Patti Smith, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And they shared a life together for a while until Mapplethorpe realized that he was gay. Their life together was not easy. He and Patti had no money. They lived in a flat with no heat. Eventually they parted but remained friends and continued to support each other's work until he died. And she still is supporting his work, and we'll talk about that in a minute. 1973, though, marked Mapplethorpe's first show as a photographer, and it was Sam Wagstaff. Here's a portrait of them together, was the man behind the exhibit. It was he who managed Mapplethorpe's career, and his contacts then opened doors for Mapplethorpe. There is a documentary out right now called Black, White, and Gray, a portrait of Sam Wagstaff and Robert Mapplethorpe, and it really talks about how Sam was the person who made Mapplethorpe Mapplethorpe. Mapplethorpe, as we all know, drew upon his sexual relationships for inspiration. Wagstaff, while not a prude, really did not share Mapplethorpe's interest in sexual promiscuity, extreme gratification, and eventual compulsive behavior. They parted after 5 years as lovers, but remained friends and business associates until Wagstaff's death in 1987. But let's talk a little bit about Mapplethorpe's shock photography. He was very well aware of the impact his work played, the idea of shock to get his message across, shocking the public to make them aware of gay issues was one of his primary goals. The graphic nature of his photography will always bring accusations that his work was merely used to shock. His choice of subject matter and a stark representation in black and white undoubtedly brings about mixed feelings from his audiences. And it's also helped fuel a debate about the relationship between art, censorship, and obscenity. Some of you, if you were my age, will remember Congress and the battle with funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, all because of a Mapplethorpe exhibition. And it was just a crazy, crazy period at that time. But while you're looking at these two slides, it's important to remember that Mapplethorpe's explicit content as a documenter, as well as an artist, helped him shed light on several marginalized communities: gay men, transsexuals, Black gay men. Mapplethorpe said, "I was looking for the unexpected, and I'm looking for things I've never seen before, and I was in a position to take those." But these two are important because it's worth noting that his homoerotic imagery only accounts for a fraction of his full body of work. He was much sought after for his celebrity and society portraits and his highly detailed images of flowers. The DIA owns 3 of his photographs, the one of Sam and 2 of calla lilies. So we have those. Before succumbing to complications from AIDS in 1989 at the age of 42, Mapplethorpe established the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation, which helps promote his work and has raised and donated millions of dollars to fund medical research in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Again, we have 3 of these images, the one of Sam and 2 of calla lilies. Any questions, Amanda?
Yes, we're wondering if any of these images are on display right now for people to come to the museum to see.
You know, what's nice about the format that we do this particular talk in is photographs are only on display rarely because of their sensitivity to light and humidity. So I have not seen the photograph of Sam on display or the ones of his 2 calla lilies that we have. So this is a great avenue to do that. It's kind of like tapestries. You know, we don't put a lot of fabric out, and we don't put things printed on paper out very often or for very long.
Okay, that's good to know. I've not seen the pieces either, so I was also a little curious about that. Thank you for letting us know.
Right. And, you know, that goes the same thing when you're talking textiles, right? Come and see the Native American galleries, because that rotates all the time as well. And we've got a, pretty fantastic collection with that.
Well, the same thing in African. And the African, sometimes the mask and some of the dressing changes as well.
Right.
All right, Dave, you got the big one here.
Right. The big one. Bum, bum, bum. Thanks. So perhaps like one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, Andy Warhol, created these portraits in 1967 for the Expo in Montreal. There were 10 images that were made in that series, and the DIA owns these 2. Although they're shown as one image, they're actually 2 separate pieces, and they're both 6 feet by 6 feet. So this is a pretty large. When they're shown together, it's a pretty large piece of artwork, and it's a self-portrait of Andy Warhol, and he's showing himself as what we're going to call celebrity, or a celebrity glamour shot. This is the type of image that is repeated over and over. And during this period, he was primarily a conceptual artist who developed the idea, but yet other people executed the work. And again, this piece was normally found in the contemporary galleries, but is currently off view. And that was due to the car design exhibition that just recently closed after about a year and a half being out on view, that took up a lot of the contemporary gallery spaces. So we're not sure when the contemporary galleries will be reopened, but we know eventually they will. So this next slide, we're looking at some of his pop art. In 1961, Warhol debuted the concept of pop art, paintings that focused on mass-produced commercial or popular goods. The Campbell soup cans and Brillo soap pads and Coca-Cola cans are widely known examples. He also created multiple images of several celebrities. Warhol's life and his work simultaneously satirized, and yet celebrated the materiality and celebrity. His paintings of distorted brand images and celebrity faces could be read as a critique of what he viewed as a culture, the American culture, obsessed with money and celebrity. And this was in 1967. I don't know if this has necessarily gone away, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But so we're looking at, the culture obsessed with money and celebrity. But on the other hand, Warhol's focus on consumer goods and pop culture icons, as well as his own taste for money and fame, suggests he's living a life in celebration of the very aspects of American culture that his work is criticizing, right? So he's enjoying the things he's criticizing. I love it. I love it. Born in 1928 to Slovakian immigrant parents, Andrew Warhol, who later changed his last name to Warhol, he dropped that final A, grew up in the neighborhood of Oakland in Pittsburgh. His family were devout Byzantine Catholics, and they attended Mass regularly. It is believed that he attended Mass every day until his death in 87. At age 8, Warhol developed a rare and sometimes fatal disease of the nervous system, and it left him bedridden for several months. While sick in bed, his mother gave him his first drawing lessons. In 1949, he moved to New York City to pursue a career as a commercial artist. He eventually became one of the most successful commercial artists in the 1950s. Are you noticing where he's standing? Can we tell what that is in the background?
Detroit.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Detroit, right? We have the Renaissance Center there. I believe this image is in the mid-'80s. I think he also visited the DIA as well. A retired employee friend of mine showed me an image of her sitting next to Andy Warhol, at the DIA. In 1964, Warhol opened his own art studio, a large silver-painted warehouse known simply as The Factory. It quickly became one of New York's hotspots. Amphetamines were the drug of choice, and cross-dressing was the fashion of The Factory. Inside The Factory, he was known as Drella, after two sides of his personality, Dracula and Cinderella. That may come back around, by the way. Warhol had a well-known discomfort with sex, and many have claimed he disliked physical contact. Although he had boyfriends, his first sexual encounter wasn't until he was age 25. He was also self-conscious about his looks, and he had terrible complexion. He started going bald in his 20s, and we see here, too, in this picture of him in Detroit, we see him wearing one of his iconic white wigs. He unfortunately died following routine gallbladder surgery. His will dictated the creation of a foundation dedicated to the advancement of visual arts, named the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Art. And here's what I really love, this piece right here, right? And one last thought about Andy Warhol, or even one statement about him. In May of 2022, Andy Warhol's colorful silkscreen print of Marilyn Monroe, entitled Shot Sage Blue Marilyn, fetched a record-breaking $195 million at auction. That's pretty incredible. And we own, 22 pieces of his artwork in various mediums.
Dave, I know this is going to disappoint you, but I lied to you.
You know what? I'm go ahead. Yeah.
I actually went down the rabbit hole and watched at least the first episode of the Warhol Diaries that you mentioned a while ago. It's on Netflix.
Yeah.
The first episode focuses on his early years in Pittsburgh, and it shows the Byzantine Catholic Church that his family attended. And Dave, if you watch nothing else, just watch the scene where they show you behind the altar is a wall of probably 15 to 20 paintings of Catholic icons. And you look at that and you can't help but draw the parallels between these celebrity things that he did in these silk screens and what this altar piece behind the altar looks like in this Byzantine church. It just blows your mind where at 8 years old, how his whole vision of pop art was formed by going to church. Just
Wow.
wow. Yeah.
Wow. And if you did, and also, I don't know if you remember seeing the electric chairs
Yeah.
done
They're
in
in
this
there.
style.
Yeah.
And when we had the pop art exhibition,
Nope.
and Warhol was talking about how once you see these images over and over, we actually become numb to that, right? And he was sort of alluding to that too, with him creating these images over and over and over and over, and then we're no longer like frightened or shocked by something like an electric chair. Oh, it's just an electric chair, which it was part of his critique on American culture. So yeah, we're pretty fortunate to have that many pieces in our collection as well.
So great. Dave, the last piece we're going to look at today is another work on paper. This drawing is from David Hockney's book, 6 Fairy Tales from the Brothers Grimm. Ours is about Rumpelstiltskin. It's called Pleading for the Child. If you know the story, it's at the very end of the story where the miller's daughter, now married to the king and just having born her first child, pleads with Rumpelstiltskin to allow her to keep the baby despite her earlier promise of giving it to him for spinning straw into gold on her behalf. When you look at this, you see her sitting down with a very sad look on her face, a tear coming down her cheek, and then you see a short, impish figure with warts all over his face reaching out for the child. The whole setting is very sparse, and traditionally, you see fairy tale illustrations that tend to rely on beauty and color to create magic. Think Disney, where the contrast between beautiful and ugly is distinguished between good and evil. Hockney's drawing for this adult book is very black and white, allowing our imagination to just roam more freely. He truly believed that while young kids like the Grimm fairy tales, they're really for adults. What's interesting is David Hockney knew at an early age who he was and what he wanted to be. This is a photograph of him taken in the early 60s by Andy Warhol. And I love this quote that I'm going to read. "Just because I'm cheeky doesn't mean I'm not serious." David Hockney was born in 1937 in England. The young David knew 2 things from an early age: that he wanted to be an artist and that he liked boys. In the mid-1950s, he saw an exhibition in Edinburgh and marveled at the way the Russian artist whose work was being shown embraced his sexuality. Hockney says, quote, "What I heard about him was he was homosexual and absolutely accepted it. And I thought, that's why I want to do, just accept it." Back then, he says, few gay men were out, most were repressed, and many were married. And he realized he didn't want to live that way. So from then on, he never hid his sexuality. He left for art school at the age of 16. He says he worked 12 hours a day on his art. He was very serious about it. In 1963, at the age of 25, he had his first solo exhibition, which was a sellout, and he then moved to Los Angeles in search of Bohemia, but truly he was an overnight sensation. His work while he was in Los Angeles in the early 60s into the 70s truly broke new ground, documenting gay love and lust, the sun-drenched plastic lifestyle of Los Angeles, but also he did the domestic decency of his parents' everyday life with their hawthorn blossom cottage of his childhood home in England. But truly for him, in reaction to the increasing conservative trends in the US and England, Hockney continues to comment that too many gays were trying to be ordinary and to fit in. He was not interested in that. He didn't care about fitting in. He continued to mourn the loss of Bohemia even today. This photograph is taken a few years ago. During the 80s, Hockney lost many friends to AIDS. This period is still very painful for him, especially when he thinks of what could have happened if all those who died were still alive, including one of his inspirations, the activist and politician Harvey Milk. Hockney will be 84 on July 9th. He still lives in Los Angeles. He still practices art. He now does it on an iPad. He just had an exhibition right before the pandemic at the Tate in London. Still popping out art at the age of 84. Just an amazing person. We own 31 of his pieces, and they're all on paper. So if you have one of those Hockney swimming pool acrylic oil paints in your garage, let us know. I'm sure the DI would love to have it.
Right, or exactly, or call one of us. Call me.
Yeah. I'll find a wall.
Like to add that to my collection. And what's interesting? This talk, Paul. We have several living artists, and I follow them. By the way, on Instagram, I follow David Hockney on Instagram, so I know that they have, contemporary social media ways of connecting with them.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe you can direct message them and get a piece directly. Right, like that.
Amanda, any questions before we wrap up?
No, but I think it's funny that that's a new way to slide into someone's DMs.
Right.
What an incredible story about David Hockney, though. I wasn't aware of that. My first introduction to him was actually on this program. He's also a documentary film producer, I believe, and we had one of his films air on this program, and that was a wonderful experience and a great first introduction for me. So thank you for sharing his story.
You're welcome. And doing reviewing the research that was given to us for this, and just for last week and this week too, some of these artists were also writers, and I'd like to look more at their what they actually have out there written, like Marston Hartley and Claude Cahun were both writers, and I'd like to see some of that work that's probably available. I'm assuming that it is, and that's just fascinating too. It's not just they stayed in one medium, right, or one trajectory of creating art, but they're also doing it in a different way, like with writing or documentary filmmaking and such.
Wow, so many talents, it almost feels unfair.
Well, right. I always talk about that too when we talk about how long it took Rivera to do The Court.
Oh, amazing.
Apparently, I'm lazy. No, a little slower of a worker, right? Like that. All right. So
thank you for sharing these stories.
Sure. So before we say goodbye, when we saw the research, in doing creating this with these pieces, this last week too, we saw how several artists actually came up with these foundations, right, and organizations for the good of the community, like with Rauschenberg and Mapplethorpe and Warhol, and we thought that was just incredibly impressive. And then also noticing too the artists that are being honored by American presidents, so we're pretty excited about that. So thank you everybody for attending session 2 of the DIA's Art Pride Thursdays at the Museum of the LGBTQ plus community artists. We hope you were inspired to maybe go out and create your own art, or come down and see the artwork at the DIA and talk to one of us docents and get a tour of the DIA. All right. Thanks so much. Take care.